Merci.
Mr. Lévesque, it has been arranged that there are 3 microphones, 1, 2, which was there, seems to have disappeared, and 3 are 3. And persons who want to ask questions will, if they can, get to the microphones. But if they cannot, they will address the question to you, and if you would repeat it over your microphone,
right.
Then it will come over the system.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for your kind introduction, Dr. Plumtree. I think you've had, with a very professional, I suppose it made it much better, a very professional translation by Professor Spicer and Monsieur Desrochers. You've had my introductory remarks, so I guess you just might as well shoot. Yeah. Miss?
Yes, Mr. Lévesque, I'd just like to ask that as a political leader in Quebec, you have a responsibility toward the Quebecers to ensure for them economic security. And we who believe in the federal system do so not because we want to cram our English culture down Quebec's throats. Actually, we want it to flourish, and we don't want to let it go. But we fail to see how Quebec can survive in the rough economic conditions that are developing in the world right now. Could you perhaps clarify this position? How can Quebec survive economically, separate from the rest of Canada?
If we go into, any kind of detailed economics, I guess we're in for half the day. Take the basic. Is the sound all right? Okay. No? This darn thing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Look, I'll just hold it. If we go into detailed economics, we'll get lost in the plumbing because it's very complicated. Take the common sense, because basically economics is common sense too. Take the common sense of economics. Nowadays, you can have the best laid plans about economics. Look at what's going on right now. It's a madhouse. You got Mitchell Sharp losing out on a tax bill on the third reading in the House. You've got Rasminsky at the Bank of Canada saying the country is going to pieces practically every year for the last 5 or 6 years. And he's not completely wrong. If you look at the latest figures, you've got the fact that we still, play around with the fact that but that we think we're still the second highest living standard in the world based on Canadian gross national product. Well, in fact, if you read the latest news, we're number 4 now. We were number 3 for the last few years. Sweden has passed us way back. And now, believe it or not, Iceland has passed Canada. Yeah. And it's a fact. That's official as of this year. And coming up fast, while we're more or less paralyzed in development, we're comfortably paralyzed, but we're not moving fast. Coming up fast are Norway, Switzerland, and a few others. Pretty soon, we're going to be somewhere in the back of the crowd of the really industrialized or post-industrial, as some of the experts say, countries. Now, in this Canadian setup, Quebec is way behind right now, at least way behind dangerously behind the Canadian average. So as far as we're concerned, it's not exactly a paradise from the word go economically, the setup presently. It may be good for Ontario, but not so healthy for Quebec. Now, inside Quebec, there's also another thing, which is rather a bitter fact, but you have to face it. We have to face it. It's that if you take out the just about 18 to 20% of English-speaking Quebecers, who more or less are a dominant minority, French Canadians are even way behind the apparent economic situation of Quebec. In other words, if we take out our 20% minority, just for the hell of it, we're way behind. Now, my basic answer to your question would be this. If we take over our own job of development, at least for all essentials, can we do any worse than that? I don't think so. This is the first basic answer. Because the rules of economics are, first of all, competence. In other words, you need competent people who will take charge of economic development. And if they're working for themselves, in other words, for their own society, and they take charge and they're competent, there's no reason why they should do any worse than anybody else. That's the first rule of economics. You can have the best laid plans on paper. If you have a bunch of incompetent people or remote people doing economic jobs, they won't do so well, which is more or less part of our experience. And the second basic rule of economics nowadays is that you have to adapt to change. Your competent people, if they are competent, have to take into account the fact that we're in a world where science is in a revolutionary acceleration. Every year, practically, you have new, either new discoveries or new developments. Technology, in other words, what comes out of science as applied technology, means of production, things like that, changes all the time. You require a lot of research, a lot of applied research, because out of that comes new production, continuously new use of materials, for instance, plastics instead of wood, and as you can see in Scarborough College, the incredible use of, for instance, cement instead of the old structural way of building things, whether you like it or not. I mean, you're an avant-garde illustration of what's going on in a lot of production fields. Now, all of that requires research. Now, right now, we're paying for research, our share, our modest share out of Quebec, but it's mostly going, as is normal, to the National Research Council, to its various affiliates, and to Atomic Energy Limited of Canada, and to Monsieur Jean-Luc Pépin's, because there's lots of so-called research being done there in the Energy and Mining Department. Well, most of that is either barred to a French-speaking Quebecer, because mostly, or not mostly, universally in those various fields, the working language for research is English. We're not doing so hot in Canada in research, but all of that which exists and which everybody pays for, including Quebec, is mostly done in English, outside Quebec. For instance, the National Research Council has never existed in Quebec as such. It's based in Ottawa. I think for years it's been working more or less out of Ottawa in the prairies with a subsidiary there, and has some setups in the Maritimes, but it's completely outside our own our own development priorities and the directions we should use the money for, as far as we're concerned. Now, all of that means that my answer to your question, without going into the whole plumbing of economics, is that we don't see how the hell, over a couple of years, or at the most 5 years, because there's always some uncertainty at the beginning when you change, fundamentally, when you change a political system. But over the 3, 4, 5 years at the most, we should be spurting ahead economically compared to what we're doing now. Yes, sir.
Mr. Lévesque, I get the impression that a separatist movement isn't exactly a monolithic movement within Quebec. If this is so, how do you differ with the RIN, or do you differ?
Yeah, well, it's not monolithic, as you say. We're in a period of very quick social change in Quebec, and I talked about that a bit. You could see it from education, from things like that have been changing very fast. Like most, we were very rural, when my father was a young man. Most of the people in Quebec still lived, I think up to 75% of the population was rural, was based on the country, in the backwoods, in small villages or small towns. Now, like everybody else, we've moved to the cities. Right now, Quebec, I think, is 80% city-based. And tied to education, to the change that's been going on everywhere, there's a lot of confusion. I think you have that confusion more or less everywhere. You have more of it in Quebec on account of the political changes, which means that quite normally you have great confusion also among the people who, stand more or less, as you would, let's use your word, for separatism in various shapes or forms. Some want to be extreme left, some are called, rightists, some try more or less to find a mainstream in the middle. So there is a lot of variety. It's not monolithic at all. The difference between us, for instance, and the RIN could be this right now. because it's changing. Even that is changing week by week. If you followed the events in Quebec, the RIN just had a break, you know, as between their main group, their main strength, and the sort of extreme group, which broke away about a week ago. So even in their case, they're changing. I mean, they're not exactly the same now as they were 15 days ago. But as of now, the main difference would be this, I think. In our case, we stand for trying to keep minds open to a possible association, an arrangement with the rest of Canada if the rest of Canada wants to go on. Because there would be, it's a fact, the Maritimes on one side and the rest of Canada on the other. It's not as dramatic as it looks on the map, because we are living in a century of quick communications, of plane, airplane, jet transport, and civilized societies don't stop at their borders. There's no reason, for instance, why it shouldn't be as easy to get from one place to another in a new setup as it is for a Canadian to go to the United States, and we don't even need a passport or things like that, as you well know. So, I mean, this is not necessarily a great difference, I mean, an unsurmountable obstacle, in other words. But we, in our case, stand more for trying as much as possible to add some immediate new relationships, if possible, in at least an economic association of some kind with the rest of Canada, if Quebec goes out. The RIN was more reluctant about that. And I think in some groups still is. Another thing is that we stand for, the group I'm part of, we stand for more definite protection for our own English-speaking minority, because I think they should be cut off from their privileged position as quick as possible. In other words, they shouldn't be a dominant group. But on the other hand, they should be respected in their language rights, their cultural rights, in other words, keep their schools and things like that. While in some cases, at least groups in the RIN would rather propose an immediate, even by legislation, you know, as was done to our own minorities way back in Ontario, not so long ago, and in Manitoba. Do the same, you know, do to others as was done unto you. Cut off school rights and things like that, which I think would not be progress, but would just breed more hostility. But we think eventually there'll be a regrouping of all that, and we hope that we'll manage to get them to accept at least the essentials of what we stand for. Yes? Might as well use the ashtray.
Mr. Lévesque, this is a statement of emotion. I think it's in contrast to the statement of cynicism and pessimism, which I listened to in the first hour of today's broadcast. Mm-hmm. It is not an English Canada I strive for. It is not a French one. One without the other is sorry testimony to the impotence of both these elements in our country to get along. Stop thinking of being a frustrated minority. Join with us. Maître chez nous can become a reality if the House is Canada and the masters are Canadians.
Well, it sounds good. It sounds good. You would make... I guess it would be a very good platform, but you'd sure as hell have to spell it out. You know, in your statement that you just made, you've got something that sounds a little bit like the end of a rousing speech, but you'd have to put a lot of meat into it, and then we'd have to start discussing it. Well, right now, all I can say is it sounded noble and uplifting.
Well, I believe that not only is it noble, but there is meat to it. And the basic idea behind it is that for too long, people of Quebec have been thinking in that narrow vein that they're Quebecers, that they're French. And too many people outside of that have been thinking that they're English. And they want to establish separate countries for one another. It's kind of a sad way of thinking, yours, where you believe that you are 1/10 of a country, and so your influence in the country is so small that, in fact, you're being culturally assimilated into a monster. Actually, the assimilation should have taken place much longer ago, but you talk about Quebec's impotence. Quebec hasn't only been impotent as far as it's concerned, it's been impotent as far as becoming part of Canada, and so is the rest of Canada, and that no one can deny. But the idea is to become Canadian and not Quebec.
No, but how do you do it? All right, do it.
How do you do it?
Yeah, but I mean, how do you get away from this frustration, the fact is that we are a minority, that we do.
Why do you think that if every minority broke away, and wanted to establish itself as a separate little country and said, well, we can't get along with these guys anymore, and we have such a small vote and everything, well, why don't we make ourselves a separate country? Because then everything will be just great.
Look, supposing you had two Negro states with 80% population in the United States, what the hell do you think would happen, especially if they were sitting next door to the Atlantic or the Pacific, not inside the country? The Negro happens to be a sort of minority inside the melting pot with a hell of a lot of problems, but no land base in the United States. So, I mean, as far as I know, they're not even close to being a majority in any state anymore. So it gives them a problem. But take other cases. Take Belgium. Take any place. Take even the little rumblings that you hear. They may look funny, but they seem to be less funny all the time in Wales and in Scotland. Take Belgium. Take Czechoslovakia, where the Slovaks and the Czechs, as soon as they have a chance, feel that in a way they'd be much better with more autonomy on both sides, and they use that word in a communist country. We've recently read about the fact that behind the facade, Ukraine in the USSR is not dead. Ukrainians have to be put in jail now because they're too nationalistic as far as the Russians are concerned.
Where does it all end?
In other words, this all means this, that in spite of our nice, easy, and in a majority case, because you're part of the majority, and we're bothering you, because you like the setup right now, and I understand it. But
you're not bothering me.
But in spite of your easy, pardon me? Sorry.
I said you're not bothering me. I just wish you'd stop thinking that we're so different and we're a minority. Right. Let's join together.
But what
Why
I
can't you
mean
think
is
that
that
way?
if you look at the world outside, you find out that federal or quasi-federal or any kind of political setup which has been organized so as to get people of different cultures to live together inside one house, as you call Canada, are more or less unstable all over, as far as we can see, and are not necessarily the best possible setup, because it's 100 years old in our case. And you think it's all right because you're part of the house and you feel all right. You say, well, you should have been assimilated long ago. I'm quoting from you.
But it isn't a house that
really a part everything of. Like that sounds normal. To us, it doesn't.
But the house that I'm talking about is an idealistic house in the future, which you seem,
yeah, but I have to live in the
present.
present.
Make your own room somewhere in the house, downstairs, and you'll have a good time because you have your own television set, and you won't have to worry about whatever anybody else in the house is doing. You won't have to worry about the refrigerator or the bathroom or the rec room, anything.
Okay, before we get to the kitchen sink, let's forget that. Excusez-moi. Sorry.
I'd like to know, what right do Quebecers have to bellyache about their position in Canada? What right? Sir, right. You cannot blame English-speaking Canada for all of your problems.
Did I do that?
Well, it's on your little blurb.
Did I blame?
Sir.
Sorry, I didn't blame English Canada at all. And if you want me to be more clear, no, but before you put your question again, if you want me to be much clearer, I tried to say, and I'm saying it now, so that there's no ambiguity about it, that most of the problems that have come up during the last, anyway, since for instance, since I was born and have started learning about them, have been mostly our own fault. But that doesn't change the fact that there is a development in Quebec which brings change.
Fine.
Right.
They are your own fault. Therefore,
mostly, yes.
Therefore, what are you going to gain by seceding from Canada? If your problems are your own fault, what are you going to gain by seceding?
Because I tried to tell you, you don't have to agree, but I'm not going to repeat it. I tried to tell you as best I could, and I think there was a very competent translation, that there is a development in Quebec now. In other words, we're trying to correct what was mostly our own fault, especially in fields like education, which bring this sort of necessity for self-determination or self-administration. And this cannot be tied, and I'm not inventing the fact that we have a crisis. It's a crisis. Every federal provincial conference and every argument about special status for Quebec, and are we going to be a quarter separate or semi-separate? Are we going to tear apart little by little the fabric that we have now called Canada? Everything more or less leads in the direction that there is going to be at least fundamental change politically. Now, it's not a question of blaming anyone. It's a question of facts developing which bring this kind of change. Now, I'm not blaming anyone for it. I tried to say it was, according to me and a growing number of people in Quebec, a healthy development which was leading to something which is not the end of the world, a change of political structure, among other things. That's all. Who's blaming anyone?
Granted that there should be a change, but I think granted that you should have control of your culture. I mean,
and our development.
And control of your education to the same extent as any of the other provinces have control over their education. I think a Quebecer should have as much right or as much of a chance in the rest of Canada as an English-speaking Canadian has in Quebec. I think
he has. As long as he speaks good English, he has.
Well, I mean, with his own language. But I think that the only way this is going to be solved is within the Union of Canada.
All right, that's what you believe, but all you're telling me is that you don't agree with me. I expected that much. But sorry.
Mr. Lévesque, you mentioned that Quebec and the rest of Canada are bad partners right now.
Right now, yes.
And no doubt that you are a smart, witty man. And you are taking this opportunity to convince so many people to your separatist movement. And you mentioned that you have 6,000 of them so far.
As regular members in 4 months,
I mean,
yes.
6,000 members cannot just take millions with them and try to establish a new constitution.
That's right.
Now, from
that will require votes.
Yes, from personal experience, I have been in Quebec City and I have been in Montreal. I have asked policemen, workers and students if they would like to separate from the rest of Canada.
And your Gallup poll?
Most of the answers were no, they don't want to separate. Now the issues, as far as I see them, are not strong enough for French Canada to separate from the rest of the country. You do not have basic issues. You do not have, your issues are not convincing enough.
May I just ask you where your accent comes from, just for curiosity's
My
sake?
accent comes from Palestine.
Palestine. Right. No, I was just... which is one of the most respectable sovereign states of the recent world.
Remember, Mr. Lévesque, that I mentioned Palestine, not something else.
Oh, so you're the other part. All right. Well,
I thought
let's not go into that.
no, but there is some question about that too. If the French Canadians and the English Canadians cannot get along together, how does the world expect the Arabs and the Jews to live together?
Well, look, that's just why I just told you. Let's not go into that because we're not going to, I think, be, let's take Quebec.
Sure,
We're not going to be the first people who are going to give the rest of the world the great lesson of wisdom, including, if necessary, drowning yourself for harmony's sake, just because you from Palestine, who come here, and quite a few other immigrants come here because they wanted to get away from trouble elsewhere, and they come here and they... No, but in many cases...
I came here for the purpose of education, and
That's
I'm
it.
getting it.
All right.
Right in Ontario.
Are you an immigrant?
Yes, I am.
All right. So if you're an immigrant, like many people among immigrants, you may have this feeling. I've found it very often. That they've come from war-torn, troubled parts of the world. They came here with an idea, in great part based on our own immigration services, that they were coming to a sort of, I nearly said second class, but let's say mini melting pot, more or less comparable to the United States, with no problems of that kind. Now, we were not consulted on the kind of harmony that you'd like to have in Canada. We're there. We also bring problems. Now, to get back to your first part, your Gallup poll in the streets of Montreal, where where policemen and other various potential voters told you that they were against what I stand for. Look, the only proof of that pudding will come eventually when we have elections. Can we leave it until then? You have your Gallup poll, we have ours, growingly. I told the audience here that we were a minority. I know we are a minority. But recently, on the CBC, about a couple of months ago, you had a nice little program, maybe some of you have seen it, saying that according to their very galloping Gallup poll, there were about 7% in Quebec, so-called separatists of any hue or form or shape or what have you. Well, I'll tell you one thing. The recent Gallup poll or sondage, you know, those soundings that parties make, since we're a poor organization, we use the other party's results. The National Union, being in power, recently had one of those regular soundings made. And in case you're interested, their own figure, which I don't think would be prone, you know, to give us more than we have, gives the various groups, of which mine is one, a potential 30% of the vote right now. And this is why you won't see an election very soon, probably, in Quebec, because they're trying to figure out where the hell they're going. We know.
Mr. Lévesque, with all due respect, I have 2 points to bring up from your book, first of all. I think we all agree in both parts of Canada, both populations, that Quebec has suffered problems for 200 years and is presently suffering problems. The thing is, in your book here, after 200 years of relative stagnation, I don't care whose fault it is. It may be Quebec's, it may be the rest of Canada's.
It's both.
200 years of relative stagnation. The past 6 years since the revolution, the Quiet Revolution, your book on page 109 cites 2 paragraphs of major changes. Mm-hmm. And I would put this on the same scale.
Quiet Revolution.
I would put this on the same scale. The advances that Quebec has made in 6 years, compared to 200 years of nothing, in 6 years you have really made a major victory in Quebec.
I think so.
I think so too. Yeah. Now, just when Quebec is starting to get on the move, is waking up, and is waking up the rest of Canada, and the students right here at Scarborough College are proving it. They're here just to listen to the problem. They're here because they're interested in what you're doing, not because they're worried about Quebec, not because they're sick of Quebec or sick of the problem. They're here because they're interested, they want to know, and they want, these people here, all of us, want to solve our problems. You compare us with Czechoslovakia, Belgium, etc. This is not fair. I think that the human can certainly develop. Now, first of all, the first contention, you have made a major victory already. If you separate, you're selling this victory down the drain, first of all. You speak of a ghetto. You're going into another ghetto. You speak of French Canadians outside of Quebec, virtually assimilated. It's a fact, according to you and some other people.
No, I said one-third.
It is not a fact.
1/3 in the last 20 years.
It is not a fact. And secondly, you speak of a new Quebec.
This is number 3.
All right. Number 3.
First, the advance in 6 years. No, I just want to keep track of you. First, the advance in 6 years, so why not go on? Because separating might break that completely. Second, you say people of French origin and the rest of Canada, I'm saying they're being assimilated. You say it's not a fact. That's number 2. Number 3?
I say they're not being assimilated. They are, to a certain degree. They have been in the past, and the situation is changing, and this is the important thing. This is the crux of the matter.
Okay. number 3?
It seems that, according to you, that a Quebec separate, and I quote in translation, will be infinitely more efficient, more prosperous, more just, and more open to others, more sure of himself.
Yes.
I think that perhaps the last item is true. A separate Quebec will be more sure of itself. Well, that's all. How can you guarantee, anyone in this world, guarantee perfection in justice and anything else? No one can do it.
I said more, I didn't say perfection.
Well, more just.
Yes.
How can you guarantee more justice?
All right, well,
This I think is, if you're talking about
would you-
utopias and...
would you let me take them one by one as best I can?
Fine.
Because you're playing politics right now. You're trying to stick me to your number 3 and make your 1 and 2 stand as they are.
All right.
But do you have a number 4, or is that it?
No, that's it.
Well, your first argument was this, that we made great advances, and I think it's true, in the last 7 or 8 years, especially since Duplessis died. No, but in fact, and more or less you say, well, since such advances were possible and have been going on and in many ways accelerating all the time, why break away? In other words, why take
now?
a chance? Why take a chance of, according to the way you put it, by separating politically?
You're on a winning streak now.
More or less, stop this winning streak. Is that it? Well, the problem with that is this: that you can't. This development, you know, this winning streak, so-called, has been spilling over in practically all fields, and including, and very, very, more and more growingly in against the, more or less hitting against the present political structure. Take one thing that looks a bit like a caricature in a way. This little fight about Gabon, you know. Well, you've got more and more people in Quebec among the younger generations, and I mean from 35 going down, and for the last 15 years we've been getting competence that we didn't have before. They want to do their own job. For instance, culturally, Quebec has the same feeling now that Ontario used to have, and still has, I think, traditionally, towards, for instance, England. For instance, for years and years, there's been an Ontario House in London. Nobody ever thought it was anything special. Quebec started a Quebec House. It was practically like bringing the house down on everybody's head, you know, because it was the minority.
It's now accepted.
Yeah, it's now accepted, but every time, and it's growing all the time, there's a need to do more of your own job.
And more is being
including
done within Confederation.
Including, I'm just giving that as an example, international relations. Well, every time this happens, because it's growing all the time and it's pushing against the present structure of Canada, Ottawa and eventually the rest, many people in the rest of the country react negatively. They say, what the hell, is this a separate country, or are they trying to become separate?
Some do.
And in a way they're right, because it leads to a sort of
this is only some
necessary
again.
Separation.
This is not the majority.
This is why in Quebec the minimum, and I'm telling you it's a minimum. This means Daniel Johnson, contrary to what the gentleman from Palestine was saying, if you look at just the minimum, which is agreed on in Quebec by all political parties, including the present government, the Liberal opposition, and naturally, to us, it's a minimum which is not acceptable. But this basic minimum is called the so-called special status, which means various new powers for Quebec. Now, as you know, a man like Trudeau, and quite a few others, he's not the only one, but he may be the most representative one, say, never over our dead bodies. And pressure and tension is building up all the time, because next year, I can tell you one thing without being a prophet. You've seen up to now, Ontario, Saskatchewan, others are coming up, all provinces slapping on new taxes, pretty heavy taxes. You've seen that this year.
Yeah.
Next year, and this has been known by all competent people in financial affairs since 1966, when the so-called tax committee report came out, next year, we know for sure that Quebec is going to be in a complete financial dead end, and will start again Johnson will call it, if he's still in power, the same thing as he used to say, complete recuperation of fiscal powers or things like that. He's just waiting to build a complete fiscal conflict with the rest, with Ottawa, and eventually with the rest of Canada, on the fiscal matter. And you know, tax matters have always been pretty damn fundamental in government. And this is going to happen at the latest next year. Next year, Quebec is going to be facing a dead end. So whether it's in tax matters or anything that has to do with administration, for instance, external affairs, development, for instance, again, a small thing recently, this so-called cinema, Canadian Film Corporation, the 10 million bucks that Judy LaMarche has been hoarding for a year or two, and now they're trying to, in her ample skirts, and now they're trying to make a film corporation out of it. Well, even on this small, apparently small matter, there's a very bitter attitude among French-Canadian movie makers saying, why the hell again? This is strictly a cultural tool. Why the hell again should we have to go begging our share one way or another? And why were these funds, at least the part that was Quebec's, not channeled towards Quebec? Now, I'm just trying to give you an example of the fact, you don't have to agree, that this winning streak of ours is a development that's going on all the time and is always hitting harder and harder against the present structures. And whether you call it special status, which Ottawa and many people in the rest of Canada will not accept, because it would be a sort of progressive dislocation of the federal structure, or whether you try and face it frankly, as we're doing, whether we're right or wrong, and saying, this is what it leads to, why not face it in a healthy way and do it? Have two separate political entities, which doesn't keep neighbors from having maybe much healthier relationships when they are free agents and when one feels frustrated and the other one feels like backlashing all the time.
But you're basing the whole thing on the fact that we've made progress so far.
This progress...
Now these other problems that exist right
yes,
now
but this
cannot be
progress
solved because of
I'm
opposition
saying
to
that
Canada.
this kind of progress, if it goes on the Quebec side, cannot be channeled in the present political and administrative structures. In other words, it means that the present political and administrative institutions of Canada will have to be fundamentally changed.
Well, this is true, except
right.
Bennett. He is the only one that doesn't accept that.
Yeah, but the change...
90% do.
The change, which is called special status, is even more unacceptable in a federal structure, and if you can work it out, which would take a long time, you send me your blueprint. I'd like to see it in a federal structure, okay? Because a lot of people have been saying, for instance, this would bring a sort of Austro-Hungarian instability. In other words, like the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, two entities...
Mr. Lévesque, may I just warn you that we only have about 6 or 7 more minutes. I see
All right.
more questioners waiting.
Okay.
So
Can we...
I'll just finish up because you have said in the past several occasions, and again in your book, you've accused many Canadians of royal snow jobs. B&B Commission, Robarts, Confederation Tomorrow Conference. Your words in November were a snow job. Your title here is endormitoire, Opération endormitoire, sleeping sickness.
I said the use that was made of a very sincere effort. I have great respect, for instance, for Laurent Do.
It still reduces down to...
The use that's being made is a snow job, yes, as far as we're concerned. And I think it's a very dangerous illusion that is being bred also among English-speaking
Well, this may
Canadians.
or may not be so, but the point still remains that according to this book, what you're saying here about the changes to be made, the entire book rests on if clauses, and I think that the biggest snow job that ever has been perpetrated in Canada is this book.
Okay.
Mr. Lévesque, just out of the sake of curiosity, if and when you take Quebec over, and if and when you make it a sovereign state, how will you treat its English minority?
Exactly, I hope, the opposite of what was done to our own minorities.
Are you sure?
I said exactly, I hope. I've been saying in Quebec in French all the time, including with the risk of having, and we're having them, quite a bit of conflict. It would have been much easier to go along with the easy trend and say, God damn it, let's do the same to them as they did to us. A lot of people feel that way. And instead of that, and this is the one thing maybe I'm most proud of, and I hope to God we can keep it that way, we'll do the opposite. And I'll fight just as hard for the rights of our minorities who are English-speaking in Quebec, their rights, not their damn dominant privileges, their rights. I'll fight just as hard for that as I'll fight for Quebec.
What makes you think that people learn by experience?
I think that people learn by development, and we're developing. Yes.
Mr. Lévesque, I'd like to get onto a more concrete issue over the referendum in Quebec on separatism.
Yeah.
I want to know how you stand on this referendum now.
What referendum?
I want to know whether, if there was a referendum today, how would you stand on it?
I'd stand for a separate Quebec, politically.
In other words, you're saying that Quebec, if you had a referendum to vote on separatism now in Quebec, Quebec, in your view, would separate
Yes.
unanimously.
No, I say I'd stand for it.
You would stand for it.
Except under Stalin, have you ever seen anything that unanimous?
What I'm trying to say is, in Quebec now, if there was a referendum,
Yes.
Next question.
Mr. Lévesque,
Sir?
Yes.
if Quebec does indeed become a separate entity,
Sorry. I'm sorry.
if Quebec does indeed become a separate entity, do you have any plans with de Gaulle, whether they be political, social, economic, or military? And if so, what are they? Well, just to state a few of them.
Yes, I know. 1, 2, 3. I think we're off the air. The goal is a sort of fixation, I think, in the United States, and also for reasons that we all know about since last summer, in the rest of Canada. Now, the way I think most French Canadians feel in Quebec, whatever happens to Quebec, is that we're basically North Americans, just as much as anybody else, except that we happen to be French. But we've been here for so long that we don't feel, we don't feel more at home, in fact, probably less, in France than you do, or an English Canadian does, and probably we feel less at home in continental Europe than you do in England, or in Scotland, or what have you. In other words, we are separated by a couple of 100 years and quite a bit of different development. Now, the only thing we are interested in, but very much so, is that culturally, and this takes in a lot of ground, because culturally nowadays, culture doesn't mean a bloody thing if it doesn't take in things like nuclear energy and satellites and things like that, because this is part of living culture. In all those fields, there should be a relationship between Quebec and France and Belgium and Switzerland and any French-speaking country that we can exchange with and stimulate each other about. Now, this doesn't take in any kind of colonialism with de Gaulle or whoever is going to be replacing de Gaulle, who's near 80 now. You don't build a future on a 78-year-old man, great as he is. So, I mean, there is a lot of fixation about this de Gaulle thing that I think it's a bit comical, honestly.
Well, when I speak of de Gaulle, I refer to France, since he does represent France.
Well, we're not, I think, aiming, not me and not anybody else that I know of, we're not aiming at going back into the French Empire.
Monsieur,
Oui, ma'am.
j'ai peur que votre nouvelle Québec ne soit un mouvement d'élite. And I'm afraid that the people of Quebec, the low people, the workers, will not benefit nearly as quickly as you think. And the fact that the economic development of Canada has been so dependent upon the cooperation of the United States, investments of the United States, will not extend to your new Quebec. And that you will need, you say, get rid of the 18 to 20% minority of English-speaking.
I didn't say get rid, my God.
No. You say, let's say, for example.
And I don't believe it.
Let's say, for example, that all these people leave, the people who have the money. Say, for example, they do, and they are moving out now, and you know it as well as I do, that a lot of money.
Quite a few of the people who have the money, that's right,
Yes,
are leaving.
All right, okay.
And quite a few of them who are used to thinking that the natives, and I'm sorry to feel bitter because I live in Montreal. Recently, I was in a so-called non-public, one of those private affairs with young businessmen, Next to me was sitting the grandson of someone who was something or other like a lieutenant governor at the time when we were completely the natives. Next, on the other side, was the nephew of Mr. McLaughlin, the president of the Royal Bank, and a few of the, all of them around the 30 or 35-year-old group, calling themselves the Whiff of Grape, very elegant little club for dinners once a month. We were discussing in private. I was trying to be very polite when one of them came up and said to me, and this was typical of the money group among that dominant minority in Montreal. He said, when you guys have finished doing what you're doing, you'll come groveling back. You know what the word means? Yes. Groveling back to us. Now, this was one of a few instances in the last few years that have helped me in a way you can't imagine to make damn sure that it's going to happen the way we think. And it is going to happen. Yes. Some of those should leave for our own health. And the quicker they leave, the better. But the low people, as to use your word, in other words, the guy that has to earn a living, and God knows there's more of them than there is of the other bunch. Mm-hmm. They're not that traumatized or, banged over the head by a possible change. I know a lot of friends in my riding who are taxi drivers, clerks in stores. Some of them are English, some of them are Jews, some of them are immigrants of other descriptions. And they say if things are done reasonably, and we are respected, and we have members among those groups in our movement right now, and they're in growing numbers. They say this might become, in spite of what I think Monsieur Desrochers was saying, a more just and a more equitable and a fairer society if it administers and develops itself than if it has this sort of irresponsibility that was going on for too long.
Yes, sir.
And I think this, without any guarantee, because nobody can be sure of the future, this we'd have a better chance of doing on our own than in the present setup.
What I'm afraid of...
And the low people, as you say, are more and more in agreement with that.
Yeah, well, what I'm afraid of, and I certainly agree, I'm afraid of the fact that what will happen in Quebec is what has happened in many developing countries who have separated, that a government of elite will come into power.
I don't believe
it. Will benefit from the independence in a monetary way.
My dear young lady, what you have now in Ontario and in Ottawa is a government of elite, money elite, mostly.
Yes, sir. But I want to ask, will it be any better?
You take a look, including with the political virgins, whether they're Trudeau or Pelletier or your English brand. You take a look at a report that has come out 2 years ago called the Barbeau Report, for instance, on the completely rotten system of financing that you call political life and we call traditionally political life. The old line parties that are financed by slush funds in the background. It's just about the only part of any kind of public life where you tolerate it. Even a charity campaign. Legislation says that if you do anything that has to do with getting money from the public, you have to make a report and have a sort of open face that people can check. But the parties that you give government to, including billions of dollars of taxes, good legislation or bad legislation, pressure in the background or responsibility facing people, you couldn't care less. Normally, we've been doing that traditionally. We give that to parties that are in the background, exposed continuously to corruption by money, by big interests. Well, I think, and we're working like hell because it would have been easier to try and finagle it through an old line party. We're trying to set up a Democratic Party, which will be financed, including by low people, but it'll be their political tool. And if we take over Quebec, I hope to God we can develop enough that it will be at least as much as possible. I have no illusions. I've been 8 years in politics.
Sir,
at least as much as possible, a healthy political development.
What I would hope that you would do, and I certainly praise this laudable
well, we're trying
speech and
anyway.
This idealism, and I feel the same way. But what I hope will happen, instead of a separate Quebec and a separate Canada and a separate British Columbia, which is certainly possible, that there will be one Canada which will be, as our friend over here said, a noble Canada, and which will be changed constitutionally. I don't think, I'm English, I'm American, but I don't think that the system in Canada is perfect. It should be changed, but all people should benefit from it, and all people should be allowed to reap its good effects, not just French Canadians alone and English Canadians alone.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Lévesque, I would
Right.
ask you not to answer any more questions because the time is up. But if
All
you
right.
want to say a word...
No. I just want to say that I'm very impressed by the fact that so many of you took the trouble of listening to this effort of mine in French. I told you from at the very beginning of it that I didn't expect many of you, or even any kind of substantial few of you, to agree. I hope it did maybe help you understand a bit what we stand for, even though we can agree to disagree. The feeling that there is behind it, and I said that at the beginning, and I think that's very important. The feeling that there is behind it, try to at least keep in your mind that it is possible that that feeling, plus whatever logic is based on it, will maybe, and as I told the gentleman from Palestine, wait for the votes, but keep your minds open to the possibility. Because the worst thing that could happen is that if I'm right, if I'm right, don't believe it, but keep your mind open to it. If I'm right, the worst thing that could happen is that we would develop so much hostility between us, so much possibility of stupid breaks and maybe at least for a while, irreparable ruptures that we'd both suffer on both sides. And I think if you think about it, this would take us back to economics, among other things, that if it did happen that way, in the worst possible way, it could very well happen that you look at economics a bit, that Ontario would suffer, if not more, at least as much as Quebec. And I'm being specific about Ontario because the powerhouse of economic development in Canada right now is Ontario. And Ontario does have, as we do on the other side, a very, very important stake in the Quebec market. And it is part of your standard of living. And it is part of your own possible development. That we have, whatever happens politically, if it happens reasonably, we keep the lines open and a possible healthy relationship. If I'm right, which doesn't have to keep you from having a good night's sleep because you're all convinced I'm wrong. But supposing I'm right. Thanks again.
I think there is probably a Stalinist unanimity, Mr. Lévesque, in wishing to thank you for a talk that was as stimulating as it was memorable. We have listened today to a man, I think, of history, a man who has a fascinating past and probably an even more fascinating future. Now, his partisans are, of course, proposing that in his future will be the presidency of the independent state of Quebec. Maclean's magazine, Maclean's magazine, in an article that I don't think Mr. Lévesque agrees with, has predicted that when the independence movement fails, after a referendum, he is going to become a lecturer at Laval University. I can only say that in this event, happy or unhappy as it may be, according to your outlook, I dearly hope that Mr. Lévesque will consider, before going to Laval, consider coming to Scarborough College to accept a job.
I offered, that was an offer I was made this morning by, I think, the principal. If Professor Spicer agrees, and if it comes to that, the only way I'd accept it would be to be giving counter lectures to his own in political science.
Just two words, please. First, the television people would be grateful if some of you could stay to be the audience, which I mentioned earlier. That would be very much appreciated. And second, of course, to thank our embryo lecturer, Monsieur Lévesque.